Not even a mouse shall pass. That was the promise whispered into the war rooms of Berlin as snow settled over the scarred battlefields of Europe at the end of 1915. But war, as always, had other ideas. The year was closing, and the German Empire found itself trapped not in defeat, but in indecision. Austria, Hungary, and Germany had together broken the Russian front earlier that summer. Serbia, the defiant thorn in the Balkans, had been erased with Bulgaria's help by autumn. On the surface, the Central Powers had the initiative, and yet, a grim realization stalked the corridors of German command. They were winning battles, but losing the war. The Entente France, Britain, and Russia simply had more. More men, more food, more factories, more oceans at their backs. If the war dragged on, numbers alone might strangle the German Empire into exhaustion. A choice had to be made. But where to strike? And how? Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, believed trench warfare had frozen the Western Front into a deadly stalemate. Attacks in 1915 had gained almost nothing. Every French assault had ended in slaughter. Every German counterattack had returned the favor. So what could break the cycle? Falkenhayn's answer was Verdun. A fortress city nestled in a narrow salient along the Meuse River, Verdun was both a shield and a trap. To the French, it was a symbol of national defiance, bristling with concrete forts, artillery, and tangled bunkers, the heart of the ancient French defense system. To the Germans, it was a bleeding artery, exposed and vulnerable. If you could strike Verdun and bleed it, might the entire body of France collapse? Or, at least, that's what Falkenhayn would claim. Later, there is a mystery at the heart of Verdun. For decades, the accepted narrative was that Falkenhayn intended from the outset to bleed France white, a war of attrition disguised as an offensive. He would not seek a breakthrough. He would force the French to defend a position of honor and lose men they couldn't afford to lose. But modern historians question that story. Falkenhayn wrote those words after the war, and there's growing consensus he may have invented the strategy to justify the disaster that followed. His real plan in early 1916, it seems, was more conventional. The German Fifth Army, under Crown Prince Wilhelm, would seize the Meuse Heights, crush Verdun's outer defenses, and take the city itself. It was to be a quick blow, not a slow bleed. The idea was simple. Verdun jutted out awkwardly from the French line. If the Germans could remove the salient, it would smooth their front, secure Metz, and strike a massive psychological blow to French morale. From the dominating ridges above the Meuse, German guns could turn the French strongholds into rubble. Falkenhayn wanted a spectacular local victory, with the option to shift to a broader war of attrition only if the first phase failed. That ambiguity, was Verdun an ambush or a gamble, a strategy or a delusion, still fuels debate to this day. Even inside the German command, the plan was poorly understood. General Constantin Schmidt von Knobelsdorff wanted to attack on both banks of the Meuse to avoid flanking fire. But Falkenhayn refused. The Fifth Army complained. Ruprecht of Bavaria called it madness, and yet the order stood. Operation Gericht. Operation Judgment would begin in February. As snow turned to mud in the Meuse Valley, Germany began preparing the greatest concentration of artillery the world had ever seen. 1,250 guns, over 2 million shells, a 2-to-1 advantage in firepower. To hide their plans, German aircraft dominated the skies with ruthless efficiency. Over 270 planes patrolled Verdun, blinding the 70 French aircraft that could barely take to the air. Meanwhile, French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre had concluded that Verdun wasn't critical. Forts, he argued, had failed in Belgium and Russia. Why would they succeed here? He stripped garrisons from key forts. Artillery was reassigned. Even mighty Fort Douaumont, the jewel of the system, was left nearly empty. Only Colonel Emil Dryant raised the alarm. A local battalion commander and politician, he begged for reinforcements. His pleas were ignored. Then came the storm. The 21st of February, 1916. The earth itself began to shake. German shells roared across the horizon in an apocalyptic barrage that shattered French positions across the Bois de Cour. Colonel Driant's men held. They fought in shell holes and trenches reduced to mud and bone. For 2 days they resisted. On the 22nd, Driant was killed. Verdun's outer line had cracked. Falkenhayn declared, "Sehen Sie, mit dem Angriff habe ich mal wieder das Richtige getroffen." See, with the attack, I was right again. On the 25th of February, German patrols reached Fort Douaumont and found it almost empty. The few defenders surrendered. No shots fired. No glory. Just stunned silence as the linchpin of Verdun was handed over like a forgotten relic. German newspapers exploded with headlines. Berlin rejoiced. But that night, French General Joffre made his fateful decision. Verdun would be held, at any cost. The French Second Army, under General Henri-Philippe Petain, rushed north. Reinforcements arrived. Engineers paved the lifeline from Bar-le-Duc, the Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way, a constant convoy of trucks delivering food, shells, and men. Petain knew he could not stop the storm, but he could weather it. He implemented the Noria rotation system, rotating fresh units in and out before they could be annihilated. 3/4 of the French army would serve at Verdun, including a young officer named Charles de Gaulle. German forces, meanwhile, did the opposite. Divisions were ground to dust before being replaced. Morale began to crack. Still, the Germans pushed on. The 6th of March. A new assault, this time on the western bank, began. The French held. 2 hills, Mort Homme and Hill 304, became names soaked in legend and blood. Artillery stripped away the surface. By battle's end, Dead Man's Hill would be 20 meters lower than it once stood. Dr. Louis Maufray, tending to the wounded in underground bunkers, described the horror of a direct hit. The shock was terrifying. The door resonated like a struck gong. We heard the big chunks of earth raining down on the shelter above us. No one breathed a word. In the swamp of Verdun, men became ghosts before they died. And yet, Falkenhayn pushed forward. By April and May, the battle became a meat grinder. The Germans attacked. The French counterattacked. Trenches disappeared into mud and craters. Thousands died to move a line by 20 meters, only to lose it again the next day. Still, Falkenhayn refused to stop. Inside Fort Douaumont, now in German hands, a careless accident on May 8 ignited a catastrophic fire. 700 German soldiers died in the inferno. Their charred bodies were found weeks later, many suffocated in corridors meant to protect them. Despite everything, German commanders believed they were winning. They had Fort Douaumont, and in June they surrounded Fort Douaumont, cutting off water and supplies. Commander Sylvain Reynaud and his garrison fought in darkness for days. They drank urine. One soldier licked condensation off a damp wall. Many went mad. On the 7th of June, Reynaud surrendered. The Germans had clawed their way through the eastern approaches, but still hadn't taken the Meuse Heights. Worse, their soldiers were breaking. Morale collapsed. Reinforcements came too slowly. Falkenhayn privately confessed to the Kaiser in early May that the battle had stalled. But still, he clung to hope. He believed French losses were far greater than they actually were. German intelligence estimated French casualties at 525,000 to 800,000. The truth? France had lost about 377,000. Germany had lost 335,000. The difference was devastating, but not decisive. Still, Falkenhayn insisted. He told the Chancellor the war could be won by winter. He lied about German casualties. He gambled on every shred of illusion his staff could provide. One officer joked they'd reach Verdun by 1920. Then came July. The German High Command launched one final push, a desperate effort to seize the last French strongholds on the eastern heights. But French defenses held. Falkenhayn's vision had run dry. His men were exhausted. The Kaiser removed him in August, replacing him with Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. They ordered an end to offensive operations at Verdun, but France wasn't finished. General Petain had already been moved elsewhere. His replacement, Robert Nivelle, had a different philosophy: aggression. He believed France could take back what had been lost. He was right, at least, for now. As October began, French artillery massed 650 guns and 250,000 shells for a limited, focused counteroffensive. Engineers studied German trenches. Artillery officers faked barrages to trick German batteries into revealing their positions. When the real barrage began, over 40% of German guns were knocked out. The infantry followed, creeping forward behind a rolling curtain of fire, a tactic known as the creeping barrage. The 24th of October. French colonial troops reclaimed Fort Douaumont. The 3rd of November. They took Fort Douaumont. One German soldier, William Hermans, fled his post and fell into a crater where French troops captured him. I cried, "Pardon, je suis votre prisonnier." I stammered, "I don't hate you. I don't hate anyone." And then I collapsed. In 6 weeks, France reclaimed what Germany had bled for 8 months to seize. By December, French troops had pushed the Germans back another 3 kilometers further from Verdun, and further from any hope of victory. Hindenburg, always the realist, gave a grim assessment. On this occasion, the enemy hoisted us with our own petard. We could only hope that in the coming year he would not repeat the experiment on a greater scale, but he would. At the Somme, and later at Chemin des Dames, when the guns fell silent over Verdun, in late December 1916, the battlefield was unrecognizable. 9 months of continuous bombardment had turned it into a gray wasteland. Mort Homme Dead Man's Hill had literally been eroded down by 20 meters. Forests were gone. Roads vanished. Craters and corpses marked every direction. And what had been gained? Strategically, nothing. Germany had failed to achieve a breakthrough. It had not destroyed the French army. It had not taken Verdun, and it had not preserved its own strength. Falkenhayn's vague goals, whether they were to bleed France white or seize the heights, all ended in the same outcome, a German defeat. Even some of his own officers recognized it. Crown Prince Ruprecht had written as early as the 20th of March. After a lovely early success, everything bogged down and the operation so much as failed. The Germans had wasted divisions they could never replace. Austria-Hungary, ignored and excluded from Verdun planning, had to plead for help when the Brusilov offensive smashed through the Eastern Front that summer. Germany entered 1917 in a weaker strategic position than it had at the end of 1915. And Verdun, what was it now? For France, Verdun became more than just a battlefield. It became a symbol of endurance, of pain, and of national identity. In the trenches and shell holes, French soldiers fought not just to survive, but to hold on to something intangible, the belief that they mattered, that France mattered, and that some things, even in hell, were still worth dying for. General Petain's calm presence, his logistics miracles, and his insistence on unit rotation helped turn Verdun into a legend. His famous order of the day, courage, en les aura, became a whisper on the lips of exhausted men. So too did General Nivelle's cry, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. The words were simple, but in a war of machinery, filth, and madness, they reminded soldiers and civilians that there was still meaning in holding the line. Yet the cost was incomprehensible. By battle's end, 377,000 French soldiers were killed or wounded. Germany lost 335,000 of its own. Over 700,000 men ground into the mud for nothing more than a few hills, a few forts, and a few kilometers of blasted earth. To historian Alistair Horn, Verdun was not a victory or a defeat. It was a trial by fire, a moment when modern war ceased to be about generals and instead became about nations enduring agony. The memory of Verdun was kept alive not just by generals and statesmen, but by the words of the men who were there. Soldiers like Hervé Lambert, who wrote home, "Corpses are touching one another, piled up on top of one another, with a smell of decomposing bodies that sticks in your throat. It's horrific, with craters so large you could put a tram in them." Or Marc Boisson, whose final letter read, "This is not heroism. This is ignominy. What kind of a nation will they make of us tomorrow? These exhausted creatures, emptied of blood, emptied of thought, crushed by superhuman fatigue. He never lived to see the answer, or Jeppesen, the German-Danish soldier who hallucinated in the night. Suddenly I saw a monster. It turned out to be a pony, long dead. The moonlight shone through its skeleton. Their stories were preserved in diaries, letters, and memoirs, echoes of souls scorched by artillery and the weight of fear. Others, like Lieutenant de Maisonneuve, worried for the future. This war has marked us for generations. It has left its imprint upon our souls. All those inflamed nights of Verdun we shall rediscover one day in the eyes of our children. He was right. Verdun would haunt Europe for decades. It became a national pilgrimage site for the French, with monuments and ossuaries containing the remains of over 130,000 unidentified soldiers. In Germany, Verdun stirred resentment and bitterness. Its failure marked a turning point, a wound in the myth of German invincibility. And yet, in time, Verdun became more than tragedy. After World War II, it became a symbol of Franco-German reconciliation. In 1984, French President François Mitterrand and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl stood hand in hand before the Douaumont ossuary, a solemn gesture that stunned the world. They stood not as enemies, but as guardians of memory, not to forget, but to forgive, not to relive, but to remind. To remind us of what happens when nations mistake pride for strategy and when generals mistake killing for victory. Erich von Falkenhayn had believed that pressure could break a nation's will. But what Verdun proved in fire, in blood, and in silence was that there are moments when pressure creates diamonds, not collapse. France bent. It did not break. Germany struck, but could not shatter. In the end, the battle that was meant to solve the riddle of trench warfare became its greatest enigma. Verdun began with a question. Can you force a nation to bleed itself into defeat? It ended with another. What if it bleeds and keeps standing? The paradox is eternal. Verdun was not decisive. It changed no front lines. It won no war, but it changed men. It changed minds. And it left a scar on Europe so deep that even a century later, its shadow lingers in literature, in politics, in memory. Falkenhayn never recovered his reputation. His strategy, if it can be called that, exposed the limits of attrition warfare and the dangers of believing your own lies. Germany would shift its hopes to the east, and later to the submarine war. But the war itself, and the world it created, had already been reshaped by the furnace of Verdun. The battle ended in December 1916, but its questions have never been answered.